So thanks for having me here today. So as Greg said, like my title of talk is just plant invasion under global change, a native community perspective. So I'll talk a lot about plant invasion and a lot about my research program moving forward. So I consider myself a plant community ecologist and a quantitative ecologist. I use a scale and environmental breadth that invasion ecology provides to understand how plant communities change and assemble under global change. So I use a variety, sorry, the light is on my eye, so I'm just going to figure out a way that I can be a little bit less like, okay, on that side? Okay. Okay, oh yeah, okay, this is great. Okay, let me move this guy a little bit. Sorry, okay. So my research combines a lot of like experiments, field experiments, observational studies, data synthesis, and also macro scale analysis. And I try to do all that using a Bayesian framework to try to combine and understand uncertainties and how we can think about probabilities into whatever we are I'm researching. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. But it's okay. It's going to like it's just the beginning. It'll smooth out. Oh, thanks. So I have studied. I need to stop looking at my notes because then I just want to say what I want to say. It's fine. Yeah. So I study a lot of different ecosystems. So a lot of my work has been done in tropical and subtropical forests, and also temperate forests. That's a lot of the work that I've been showing today. It's on temperate forests, but I'll bring a little bit about why I got so interested into invasive species and invasive plants and the problem of invasive plants into our native ecosystems. Can I change with this one? Okay, so starting off that, like when we think about plant communities, so plant communities are a group of plants that are interacting with themselves and with the environment and all the other organisms that are in that plant community. So when we think about that, we can think about the assembly of these communities, how they get into the shape where they are. And the drivers, they're shaped by environmental variability, biotic interactions, disturbance, dispersal, establishment. So all of these components are key processes that lead us to have our plant communities the way that they are. And they provide a lot of processes and functions that we are really aware of. So when we think about ecosystem services provided by plant communities, so we can think about carbon, we can think about soil or having like really like that soil preserved into that ecosystem. We can think about all the trails that we take advantage of. So those are all ecosystem services that our plant communities provide. The problem is that according to the IBPS global assessment, the last report, a lot of those communities are facing direct changes in their assembly and their composition. And their main drivers, as they're said in this chart, are land use change. We're really aware of that. Direct exploitation of those plant communities, climate change, pollution, and they bring up here invasive alien species. So I like to use, there's a lot of discussions around terminology about invasive species. I'm going to tell you about two terms that I'm going to use throughout this talk. And I'm not going to use invasive alien species, although they use that term. I'm going to use introduced species for species that are being brought intentionally or not from across their distributional ranges. So I'm going to use that term, that broad umbrella, for species that are not native to an area. And another one is invasive species, when they are brought into that area and they're able to sustain a population and disperse into different areas and really become problematic to our native ecosystem. So I'm going to use those two terms and avoid the use of invasive alien species, but I'm happy to talk to you all about like terminology. I think that's really important topic in invasion ecology, and we don't talk about that often enough. So I got really interested in invasive species because they are really drivers of change of those plant communities. And I want to bring that up because when I was really many years now ago in my undergrad, I did an internship in a protected area. That protected area is located in São Paulo. Its name is Estação Ecológica de Angatuba. So in that area, we have what we call Brazilian Cerrado. It's akin to a savanna. So it's an open area. Unless it's really close to a water body, then it gets more of like a forest, like a more dense forest, but it's still like very driven by a soil that is very sandy. And as we move forward from that water source, it gets drier and drier. So then that system becomes more open. have a lot of less big trees and more of the herbaceous layer become really important in the shrubs. But as you can see, I hope you can see here. So we are like, I came really far to come all this way. Joking, I came from a different state in the US, but we have, I hope you can see, we have a lot of slash pine recruits here. You see like the pines in the photo? So this area actually was recently managed, and I'm going to tell you why, like that's where I got so interested about invasive species, because this area, they brought in slash pine, and that was the government many decades ago to replace the use of a native species that was endangered, and that is Araucaria angustifolia, that beautiful species. It's a very slow growth, and they use a lot of them in the paper industry. So because of all that constraint, it's like, okay, we're bringing in a different species that can go fresh in this environment, and we can use for the same uses that we use that species. The problem is that slash pine became really invasive. So they had all these plantations to try to figure out if the best genetics for that area, the best traits for those species, but they became really invasive into those areas. And this, in this particular protected area, what we had was something like this. It's really dark. I'm not sure if you can see, but this is an open cerrado environment, completely full of slash pine. And it's full because the surrounding of this area, which is like the protected area, is from this road onwards. Before that is another part of the government area. Still, it's called an experimental area, where they planted a lot of this slash pine. So they're just like the seeds are just like moving forward, moving to this area that is really open, sandy soil is really good for this species. And this area they went through, they went through management action. So you can see that's the same area after they removed all the invasive species, but that doesn't last long because as you can see on the, I think now you can see from the back, that's all slash pine coming in again. This area is really, really important for a lot of different reasons. Plant communities, but plants are hard to tell people that like, oh, this plant is really cute. It's really important for pollination, and all these bees or all these other animals are supported. But there's also a lot of the what we call them our animals that are really famous in that area. And it was a good way of thinking about and bringing people into why we are doing all this management, because it can be really tricky to just remove a lot of species from that area, a lot of trees. You're just like removing all the trees. Why are you doing that? So black lion tamarin was locally extinct, and once the management action was done, it started to return from other surrounding areas, and we had quite some pumas to moving around in that landscape. That's like some examples of animals that were really important in that area. So thinking about invasive species, I became really interested in like, I want to tell people why this is a problem and why we should care about. So while I was there, we did two main initiatives. One is to create a comic book. I do not draw like this, but I came up with the idea and the writing of this story, and that's for the kids in the schools around the protected area. And the other one was creating some videos about not only invasive species, but like also about other ecological components of that area for the high schoolers, because they were like not going to look at comic books. So this is how I got really interested in invasive plant species. But a lot of our focus and what we use, the way that we think about invasive species, we think about the invader. We think about the plant species that's there, that's slash pine, that is on that particular environment. What I've been trying to do over the years in my research program is to move away from only thinking about that species, but thinking about the native community. What is around that community? What can be in that community together with that invasive species? How can we manage that native community to potentially be more resistant to those invasive species that are coming in? It's really hard to predict which invasive species is going to be the next one. We're getting better at that, like thinking like, oh, this is invasive in another place that has similar climate. This is probably like to be a problem here, but it is still really hard. We have so many different species. It's hard to keep up with like that newcomers, right? So I try to move away of thinking not only about the invader, but thinking a lot about the native community perspective of that. And that's what I'm going to bring for you guys today. So the main question that I have in my research program is how do plant communities assemble and respond to global change with a special focus on invasive plant species. And I try to do that using a multi-scale approach. So at the macro scale, for example, I usually think about understanding impacts on the native community and the mechanisms of invasion, how those invasive species can actually get into that community and establish themselves. So at the landscape scale, I try to understand community assembly. So really trying to understand how those native communities are reassembling after remove those invasive species, how they're becoming the way that we are seeing them after those actions are done. And then at the local scale, really investigating processes of ecosystem services, ecosystem functionality, and changes in those ecosystem functionalities given invasion and when we manage those areas. And then recently, I've been incorporating not only that spatial scale when I think about these problems at different scales, because invasive species really need, like, the processes are happening at multiple scales. That's why I bring that to my research, but also starting to think about temporal scales. So really, the main focus has been, as of now, on trying to understand memory of those plant communities, and I'm going to talk a little bit about moving forward as a case study. So I'm going to talk to you guys about three topics. So about a case study at landscape scale, case study at the local scale, and a little bit of the temporal scale, because that's where I think my research program is going to move forward from only thinking about the spatial, but like incorporating that temporal scale. So starting by the local, and then we're bringing that up. So here, my main question at the local scale is how does the total and native community change in trait-related ecosystem functionality? That's a mouthful of question, but it's really thinking about how those native communities are changing or not given an invasion. And that's thinking about traits and how that traits would potentially relate to functionality of that native community. So bringing the same diagram that I brought before. So all this plant communities, and here's really focused on forests, how those forests, they really provide those ecosystem services that I mentioned before, and we're pretty aware of those. And they are provided through ecosystem functions. So those native communities, or those communities, invaded or not, they are through those ecosystem functions, so such as net primary productivity, or they are providing those ecosystem functions. And we can have plant invasion affecting those communities and the provision of those ecosystem functions in two different ways. One is just being part of that community and bringing in new traits and bringing new ways of using those resources and being in the cycling. The other one is modifying, because of the impact that they have on the native community, modifying the assembly, which species are in that community. And those native communities are then, when we compare to an uninvaded area, they're providing different functions because the species composition is different, or the relative abundance of those species is different from an uninvaded area. So those are the two main ways. And the way that I investigated this is really making the link between the plant invasion through functional traits to infer ecosystem functions. So there's a lot of literature linking functional traits to provision of ecosystem functions. So I investigated plant invasion and those functional traits. And I selected three different plant traits, and those plant traits, they fall into this acquisitive to conservative end. So plants that are really acquisitive, they would have high specific leaf area and leaf nitrogen. So they go really fast, they have thin leaves. And the other end is when they would have high leaf dry matter content. Those are species with slower growth, and then they would have larger leaves, like thicker leaves. So it's really thinking about that trade-off, and within that trade-off, we would have these functions are being provided in different ways. So the novelty of this is the modeling approach, because I use three traits that are correlated, and we have to account for that. And then differentiating change from impact. To do this research, I established that's in Southeast Michigan. So there is this research area called George Reserve. And then from there, I established 30 transects and sample the vegetation there, and then link that into traits with using the TRI database. So the rationale behind this is that if we think about, we have here invasive species cover from low cover to high cover, and that on the y-axis is our trait weighted by abundance of those species in that area. When we think about total community, what I mean by that is the natives and the invasive species that are in that area. One way that we can think of that community is changing is we increase the invasive species cover, that cover is going, that invasive species is going to have a higher abundance, and then that trait is going to, that trait value is going to increase as we increase invasive species cover. So that is a change of the total community functionality, because that will relate to functions that those traits are providing. But we can think about in many different ways that only the native communities, the native species, when they are being invaded by those invasive species, are responding to this invasion. One is that if the invasive species would not actually change which native species are there, and that would imply that with the invasive species cover increasing, would have similar levels of that trait for the native community only. And I'm calling this complementarity. Invasive species are complementing the native community. But we can also have another scenario, which is be more intuitive for us to think about. So there is an impact on the native species, and the provision of those, the trait distribution of that species, that community is going to change. So we can have an exclusion or a displacement where the native species that have that particular trait are decreasing over time. No, like across the invasive gradient, or they're increasing. So they're being selected to have that particular trait because of that interaction with the invasive species. When we think about those three scenarios, which is really, we usually don't think about only the native species in when they are invaded by those invasive species, is like thinking about management. If I remove invasive species from this community, if we have the scenario as everything is like flat on the native community, that would be okay, because I'm removing those invasive species and our native community is having similar traits and likely similar functions in that community. But if we do on the other two scenarios, we would need further management if we want to get into a place where we would have that flat line. So it's either like changing the species composition or manipulating a little bit of what is coming in when that dispersal. So just having those two on the side. And then what I'm going to show here is this CWM is the same as the trait weighted by abundance that we had before. That's community weighted means. And then we have invasive cover from low to high. And I'm showing two traits because the leaf dry matter content, there was no change at all, like nothing was significant. So I'm showing the ones that have some more interesting results. So leaf nitrogen and SLA, those are both the acquisitive traits, the traits where in the end the species grow faster, they have thinner leaves. So as we increase invasive species cover, we see that the total community is moving up, but there is not a lot, especially for leaf N, right? Like that's really clear. And then for the native community, nothing is changing in that particular trait. So if we were to remove that species from those invasive species from this community, we would have similar traits weighted in that community. And there is a little bit of two positive slopes here for both native and invasive in that particular trait. So that shows two things. One is that when we manage those communities, we are managing for the whole community. And we think about which trait, like we would need to target which trait we want that community to have those functions being provided. And then the other one is, if we were to remove invasive species, we would likely have something similar for one of the traits, but it's not for the other. So that's a multi-facet way that we need to think about our management moving forward. And a lot of that increase that I'm showing the leaf N is because those forest understories are heavily invaded by Elaeagnus umbellata. So autumn olive, it is a nitrogen fixer. So that has a lot of the impact on why we have so much leaf nitrogen. And then the soil samples too, they show like a lot of more that soil nitrogen underneath those invaded understories. So when you think about ecological outcomes and then management implications, so we had that positive effect for SLA and leaf nitrogen. The native community functionality remained unchanged, at least for leaf nitrogen. So the native community there is able to withstand the similar traits. Having then the complementary scenario where if we were to remove invasive species, that community, at least for that trait, would be able to withstand that functionality. So it brings attention to, we have to think about what we want for that community to move forward when we manage those communities. If we were complementarity, just removing is enough. If it's some kind of displacement, favoring one or other type of native species, we think like of what other actions we can do on that community to restore the functionality that was lost or gained in a way that we don't want that community to move forward the same way. So moving forward to our second case, so landscape. So broadening up instead of one single site here, I'm going to show you like a few sites in which this research project was performed. So really, I'm thinking about mechanisms of community assembly. So I'm testing one particular mechanism, priority effects. If once remove the invasive species, if priority effects would be in place. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So what a usual approach in forest understories is just to go there, remove the invasive species. So that's the man. We remove the invasive species and see what is going to come in and populate that area that we just managed and remove the targeted species. But they're like broadly thinking about what happens when we do that is that an increase of resources because there's not a lot of species really using the resources that are available in that ecosystem and that particular community. And then it's a decrease in competition because we have like a land that doesn't have a lot of other plants that are competing for the resources for light, for nutrient. And so then inter-specific competition is really low in that scenario. So when we think about that community that's coming up, there's dispersal of seeds and propagules into that area, but we don't know what's going to come next. So is it going to be like if the landscape is full of native species, then likely what's going to come next is like what we want that community to be, dominated by native species. Or if it's not, which is usually the case in those areas, a lot of invasive species are going to come in and take over that community. So thinking that the order of that species arrival, so if native or invasive species start first, that community would then give them this advantage of using these unused resources and this low competition levels. And that's where priority effects come in. That's just a fancy term or the proper term to think about in ecology of when that order of species that start that community is going to dictate how that communities look like in the long term. And I had two students that work in this project. So this was a multi-year field experiment. I'm going to show you a little bit what that looked at. So I had two students working that project. So Tia was a Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program student. She came from that program and she stayed with me for the summer. So she was able to collect her own data in the plots that are already set and present that at the end of her program. And then the other one was Kelly. So Kelly was a Europe student. That's an undergraduate research opportunity program at University of Michigan. She stayed with me for a full academic year, so she was able to do a little bit of fieldwork because it overlapped with the academic year. So she collected a little bit of the data and used a lot of the things that I had to ask her own questions and present her own project at the end, like the results of her project at the end of the program. So the novelty here is that priority effects are rarely investigated in forests. So it's really common to use that concept of thinking about it in ecosystems that has a faster turnover. So like grasslands is really more like where it's common. So thinking about priority effects in the context of forests and invasive species management in forests is really novel. And this multi-year monitoring is not a long term. It was like I established 1 year and then 3 more years of collecting data. So it was like a 4-year experiment, and it allowed me to understand a little bit of the importance of year-to-year variation in the climatic effects and how that had an impact on my on the results. So I used 4 different areas. So this is the more urban area. This is Ann Arbor in Southeast Michigan. So I had some like plots like really inside of the urban area, and that expanded across from urban to rural area until George Reserve, which was that one that I focused in the beginning. That local study wasn't in only that one, which is far from the urban area. So it was just like moving forward from the urban to the rural area. And the experiment was done in a way that I removed all the invasive species from my plots. So you can see a little bit of the poles, like there's one pole here and one pole here, and those are the same poles here. And then I had those 1 meter square plots where I did a lot of manipulation. So I'm showing part of that. There's a lot of other treatments that I use in this. But the main ones that I want you to focus on this in the stock is I had the 1 year removal. So I just went there, removed 1 year, all the invasive species. And the multi-year removal, where I came back every year and removed those invasive species, the newcomers again. And the reasoning of doing that is that with 1 year removal, we are expecting that whatever comes in is going to be the one, it's going to like the advantage of having the 1 year removal is that whatever we removed, like the dispersal of that species, those species, the community from the landscape around, are going to be dictating that community over time. But what we know is that invasive species usually, and more often than we want, reinvade those areas, either the same species or different species that were at low abundance and come back and invade those areas a lot more than they were before. So the multi-year removal is giving those priority effects a little bit over time. So I'm trying to give the native community more time to establish. We know that they have like the establishment rates are lower, they grow a little slower than those invasive species. So it's just giving them a little bit of more room to try to overcome that invasive species coming in so often. And then I did what I'm calling here control, is which I did not seed any species. So whatever is coming in from the landscape, that's what I'm going to get in that community. But then I also wanted to provide those priority effects. So really like seed those native species that could potentially overcome that invasive species, really aggressive coming in. So I seeded forbs and I seeded forbs and grasses. So native forbs and native, like it's a seed mix. So I used seed mixes from a local seed farm. So in attempts to see if whatever people are using in that landscape to restore their areas would be effective to do that in our like experiment, and thinking about the processes of ecological processes behind that initiative of implementing of like managing those species coming in, being very intentional about it. So the next graph is going to be a little busy. So I'm going to show an empty graph that I'm going to tell you what's going to come next, and then I'm going to show the busy graph, okay? So what we have here is native community recovery rate, and that's going to be a mean and 95 credible interval, and that's on our y-axis. And then the x-axis are the 3 years that I did monitoring in that area. So I established everything, most of that in 2019, fall of 2019, removed everything, seeded, so then they would be like in the winter, so the species would be acclimated, and then I monitor that for 3 years. And then, as I mentioned, I have the 1 year time removal and multi-year removal, and that's going to be lighter color and darker color respectively. And then control, no added native species, like whatever comes in is that community is going to look like. The forbs and grasses are going to be triangle, and then the square forbs. So the species that I actively put in those plots to see how they're going to look like. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of differences across all my treatments. Although I tried to do like all the different years and like keep removing those invasive species. So what I say that because when we think about our controls with all our treatments, everything kind of overlaps besides this year. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this, but everything kind of overlaps, right? So there's not a lot of difference. When you think about forbs and grasses and forbs, it's also like not a big difference on that recovery rate. So that's how fast that community is going to recover from 1 year to the next. So how fast that abundance is going to increase from 1 year to the next. That's not really a lot. But when we think about 2021, the plots where I did multi-year removal, the native species didn't have a lot of difference, but like where I removed the invasive species for a little longer, we had that rate a little faster. I was like, what is happening with this year? It was like when you're doing a lot of field work, it's kind of a blur. So I was like, okay, what happened in that year? So when you think about the differences in environmental conditions from those years, 2021 had a lower vapor pressure deficit. What that means is that the water demand from those plants were much lower. So the years were wet, that year was wetter than the other ones. So when we have a more mild year, we don't have a lot of drought. Those native species, regardless of me adding them there or they coming in, they are able to have that recovery rate a little fast. So drought is really going to impact those communities moving forward, regardless if we're adding them there or if they're coming in into those communities. And I also checked about native richness, if plots that were having higher native richness, if they had like any faster recovery rate. So they did. So the effects of having a higher richness was really important to have higher recovery rates. And if the native species were more on that acquisitive end, that faster end, that they have similar traits to the invasives, right? Like growing a little faster and being more resilient to those high resource areas. And then light and soil moisture, they didn't have a lot of difference. And that, like, it's an effect across all 3 years. So here it's just like a little bit blur of that difference in 2021 from the other years. That's all like merged here together. So some outcomes from this, and then the management implications. So priority effects was not really the mechanism driving the assembly of those communities once I removed the invasive species. But what we saw is that the environmental conditions in which that year was facing was really important to improve the recovery rates of those native communities. And then if we have communities that have higher richness and higher specific leaf area, so if they are more acquisitive species, they have a higher chance of increasing their abundance over time for the native community. And here's the caveat of the management implications. So it's really hard to predict what's going to look like, right? So like what is next year going to look like? We're seeing that the climate change and global change has been very unpredictable in many ways. We try to predict, but then something is going to happen. But if we know that it's more likely than not to have a very drought year next year or this incoming season, it might be better to wait a little bit if you're doing to put if you have one chance of putting all your efforts into management of that area. Maybe that's not the time for you to invest all your money. If you want to spread out a little bit, or if you want to if you want to wait another year to try to really do that investment, because it might not be worth all your plants are not going to actually establish that community the way that you wanted. So it's really thinking about that whole spectrum of the management, which is only this is the money that I have, I'm going to do this, but look, when is the right time to do that? Might be something we have to start considering more and more often. And now I'm going to move to a case study that it's at the local scale, but also incorporating the temporal scale. And I'm going to bring you from forests to grasslands. And that's when we think, when I mentioned a little bit before about the memory of those plant communities and thinking about ecological memory of plant communities over time. So I want you guys to think, how many of you do food work? Okay, for a bit. So, this is 2024. We are 2025. I didn't notice that preparing this for my brain is still trying to figure it out 2024. Okay. So assume it was last year food season, right? Which is, yeah, it's all good. What did you have for lunch in your field work? So if you try to think about it, it might be easier for you to remember what you had more often, unless you're someone that cannot have the same food every day, and then you kind of very fancy and bring every single day you have a different food. That some people are like that, but I didn't have a lot of time and energy to think about my food. So let's say that for last food season or year 0 here, I brought some burritos, and the way that we did when we went to Missouri was to warm them up. They might not be safe health-wise, but we warmed them up on the inside of the car because it was so hot in the windshield. So we just put them there, and then they would be really well cooked by noon. But then on the year before, I was like, okay, what do you have the year before? So let's say that I kind of I'm pretty sure it was a chickpea sandwich. I was pretty sure it was that. And then the year before that, I was like, I think maybe it was fancy and I was bringing some rice beans and some vegetables, so a burrito bowl or something similar to that. And then how about the other year, the year before that one? Was that PB&J, or am I mixing those 2 years? I was am I bringing something that was... So then our memory fades over time. And that's how we need to think about our plant communities over time too. So when you think about ecological memory, is those plant communities, they are going to respond more firmly, and they are going to have that main response for things that happen really on that year or the year before. But then over time, those communities are going to have some signal of that change, but not much. And that change can be through some species are more sensitive to those conditions and they die, or they're going to be more in the seed bank, or they're going to just die in the seed bank. So there are multiple mechanisms in which we can think that community is going to have that memory. It's really what that community is going to look like and what the impacts are and how long that impact lasts in our community. And that's what I'm trying to investigate using grasslands. And the main question for this project is how global change factors influence the timescales in which those past environmental conditions alter productivity of grasslands. So those past environmental conditions is my memory. And if we have disturbance, if we have nutrient addition in those plant communities, does that have a strong effect, or does that affect our communities, how they are going to remember what happened to them? So how they are going to have that long-term effect. And as you can see, time is really important here. So I needed a data set that is really long-term data set, not something that I can do my multi-year field experiment to understand that, right? So I'm using a lot of the data from Cedar Creek. So it's a long-term ecological research. Like I'm sure like some of you are really familiar with that. It's particularly Cedar Creek. So they have had full factorial design in which they did tilling at year 1, like year 0. Half of the plots gone through tilling, so they just removed all the vegetation. They tried to remove as much of the roots that were there, removed everything, and the other half they just let the old field to be the way that it was before. And then they, with the plots, they did several, like around, I think it was 9, if I remember correctly, 9 control. Yeah, 9 different nutrient additions. So going from very low nutrient addition to very high, like a lot more than you would expect to be happening in those communities, even with all the nutrients that we give them in the input as like through agroecosystems usually. And I'm trying to understand how those 2 main global change factors impact those ecological memory of that community. Assuming that a community has ecological memory, that's also an assumption, and then that's what I'm also investigating. So the novelty is really the quantification of this lagged effects on this environmental variables, on this climate variables. That's something that has been a lot done in tree rings to understand those growth of trees over time, but it has not been done with productivity and thinking about plant communities as a whole. And here I'm bringing one model. So if you're too scared about the equations, don't worry, because everything is similar with matching colors. So what we have is plant biomass as my response variable. I have an autoregressive term because the plants that are this year in that particular community are related to whatever was there the year before. So I have to have an autoregressive term. And then I'm having temperature and precipitation and quantifying those ecological memories of temperature and precipitation over the years, and then that nested within the months. So then I have this like hierarchical way of thinking about those ecological memories. And then I'm doing that, a model for the plots that were disturbed and a model for the plots that were not disturbed, and then the nutrients too. So it's just like all this combination of this understanding. So this plot is going to be a little busy too. So that's why I'm going to walk you guys through this. So this is like how important that year or that month was. So importance of 0.5 is just like, that's a scale from 0 to 1. So it's like 50% important to predict that plant community productivity. And then over time, I have here months from 0 to 60. And then we have intact on the first row, so no tilling, and then disturbed on the second row. And then we have precipitation on the left, and yeah, and then temperature on the right. And then we have on the row, oh, those are columns, sorry. So the columns for intact and disturbed, and then the rows for the nutrients. And I'm not bringing all the 9 because it's just like a lot to think and to think about. So I'm bringing like something that doesn't have any nutrient, and then our controls, right? And then we're having like a little bit of nutrient, something that it's going to be around where the nutrient limitation is overcome. And then this is just like a lot of nutrients. And then the pattern is like, when we think about that analogy that I did with what do you remember, what we ate for a field experiment, right? So what we would expect is something that our first, these are the year importance weights and the tiny ones are the months. So let's just focus on the years because it's a lot coming here. So what we would expect is like something that goes from higher importance rates and then fading over time, the way that we think about memory. But what is happening here is that as we increase nitrogen addition, there is some like years that are really important here. So there is, and this kind of patterns in which we have, this is year before. So this is a little bit higher than the other one. So what is happening is that we increase nitrogen addition, what is happening with those communities, they are getting more of the same species over time. So they're being dominant by one species, and that species is a very specific way of capturing those effects on of the environment. And then similar in a sense of having like this like outliers when there is higher nutrient, like in different years, but those communities are like shifting the patterns of like having of that particular year that is like current year and the year before more important and then fading over time. So that is shifting over when we have higher nutrients. It's not a lot for intact and disturbed. The difference is not as much, but there's still like when we get really high nitrogen, high nutrients, it's just hard to predict what's happening in that community. It's really like with respect to what that community is dominated by. So ecological outcomes. So more or less current and past and first past year are really important, but that relationship changes as we move forward with higher nutrients. And then the management implications is that when we think about ecosystem productivities and functions, we have on those functions that those ecosystems provide. We might also need to think of what they're facing past this year and the year before. So what happened to that community and how that community is going to move forward. And that is with respect to which species are there, the abundance of them there, and how we want to manage those communities to provide the functions that we need. And we should try to start incorporating those lagged effects in our predictive models, not only for this recent past, but a little bit further than that. And it's the hard part of all that is that those models are very heavy on how many variables they have and how much latent variables they have. So we need long-term data, like long-term plant community data. And we have to start exploring there's so much data out there, but it's also like there's a lot of ecosystems that we don't know a lot about their long-term behavior and what those communities look like. So, but we have to start knowing about them because it's going to be really important thinking about those management implications moving forward. And then I just want to give a little bit of a glimpse about macro scale. So I'm not going to talk about any specific case, but I've done quite some work at the macro scale too, and that has been really rooted on the collaborations that I've done over time, because that's like it was a new like a few years ago, it was like a new branch for me, and that the collaborations really brought me into the place that I feel comfortable working about like different those at the macro scale. So there's this database that we incorporated, I harmonized vegetation surveys across the US, trying to put them in a way that we would know which species are there, how abundant they are, if they are native or introduced to that area, and then thinking about those patterns and processes across scale in the continental US. And also then using this as our base to bring up something like this, where we incorporated traits too, and we are seeing that all communities, regardless of ecosystems, of ecosystem type, they are tending to be more acquisitive with that high invasion. So really thinking about those processes at the macro scale. I'm happy to talk more about this work if anyone is interested to. And then lastly, which I think I have a little like 5 minutes and then I'm going to be done with this. I want to talk a little bit about how I see myself expanding my research program if I would to come to Southern Illinois University. So a vision for a future here is to build a lab that is really focused on global change and invasive species and how those plant communities are changing with respect to those two components of drivers of change that they have. And to do that, focus on the research is to gain this cross-scale understanding of the effects and the effects of and responses of global change of plant communities, with a special focus on forests and invasive plants, because I've been working a lot of forests, but a lot of my work has been across different plant ecosystems and plant communities. And to do that, as I said, is continue to do my work in the macro scale, landscape scale, and temporal scale. So thinking about something like macro scale drivers and context dependency of global change impacts of plant communities, effects of plant dispersal traits, and dynamics in changing landscapes. So going from urban to rural landscapes is a clear example of how it could do that. And mechanisms of plant community assembly in response to global change. I know my priority effects field experiment was a little bit of a bummer that I didn't get that. What I expected. Priority effects is like the thought about like the concept about it is really, really meaningful, but I didn't get what we would expect to. But I still think that we know very little about community assembly and how those communities assemble after we do invasive management. So it might not be priority effects in that particular context, but what else can we really think about those communities, how they're assembling to be the way that they are now? And expanding the temporal scale to the ability that I could do with the data sets that are available out there to investigate ecological memory in plant communities recovery. So using that for different plant communities, grasslands, but also like other communities, and thinking about their recovery too after some drivers of change. And thinking about that is really the intersection, is moving forward. Like that's like a plan for 5 to 10 years. It's like, is really being the intersection here, not only like this like pieces, but getting them together and understanding how those plant communities are moving forward in the spatial and in the temporal scale. And this really aligns to the vision for continental scale biology. This was published late last year, 2024, late last year, by the National Academies. And it was like this group of researchers really like that did a lot of macro systems work. And really like how are we thinking about global change and our ecosystems and our biodiversity? How are we moving forward that way? And what they really bring in this report is like really doing this cross-scale understanding and really integrating these scales of space and time. And I think my research program is really like at the forefront of like pushing that needle, like and really getting us to like getting some answers and getting some more understanding of how those communities are changing. Second, I want to build a lab that expand the research opportunities for the students and to amplify scientific network and funding options. And I do that through, I would do that through a lot of the collaborations that I've been building in the past almost past decade now. So I have participated and still participating in working groups. So NC's Paul Center. I've recently joined DRAGNet. So it's a drought and resource grassland network. So those are like experiments that are being replicated across the globe, that in which they are manipulating those grasslands with disturbance and addition of nutrients and seeing how those communities are changing over time. And lastly, to foster a sense of belonging, to support the School of Biological Science curriculum and its commitment to teaching excellence. And I'm going to bring something about DEI now, and I hope with all the different changes that we have had, it's all good with you all, because I debated a lot if I should bring this or not. But I want to bring this up because I think this is like the root of who I am. I am a first generation student. English is not my first language, but I came all the way, and then I am here now like showing you guys all my research and what are my plans to move forward. And this is like part of who I am. So when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, I have a commitment to address inequality. And when we think about that, being very specific is recruitment of underrepresented students, recruitment of women. It's like having a gender and race balanced syllabus. I think that's really important to think about like what are the stars of our field, but also like who is also doing so much good research that we don't know about, and we could bring that into class. So having inclusive mentorship and teaching. So have clear co-produced expectations. I think this has been really helpful for me moving forward as a researcher. And I think that's how we should like have my students in my lab moving forward with like, this is like what we agreed upon. It's not like written in rock and like, you know, like things are like, we can change, but it's like having it clear so we can move forward together. And using like online tools for anonymous feedback and engagement. This is in class within the lab. And then continue learning of all this. This is a delicate topic and it can be really challenging. Like my experiences and the experience of others are different. But really like educating myself and move forward in that scenario and what our students' needs are and what the department needs are in that scenario, and then moving forward that way. So just a little bit more teaching and mentoring. So the way that I approach teaching is using as much as possible universal design of learning. So different ways of bringing that contact and different ways of the students getting interacted with that contact. Have a combination of different learning assignments, have been really clear with instructions and transparency. So clear expectations that brings from mentoring and teaching, and try to foster a classroom environment that everyone feels comfortable asking their questions. No questions are dumb. We can all like learn this together. Like that, I think that's key for my teaching philosophy. And mentoring, being upfront about expectations, create a safe space where students can feel comfortable to share like they're like I'm not understanding this, and then let's try to work on this together. And connected students with different resources. So I have a large collaboration network that my students could leverage and then do like, are you more interested in doing macro scale studies? Okay, we can do this together and maybe connect with people that would be really good for you. I want to do more of this other type of work. Like, who can we bring in together? And then you can have that experience of this is SIU and this we can do really good research, but how can we also have those other people with different thinking about that particular topic bringing into this? And the Dragnet network is one of my most recent additions to my portfolio. So I want to acknowledge and thank all my close collaborations, all my funding sources that they let me be here all the way until now, the labs that I've been at. And thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions.